Hello and welcome to time-lapse imaging with lamp and LED, stability versus repeatability, a webinar presented by Photonics Media and sponsored by X-Cite, now part of Excelitas Technologies. Before we begin, just a couple of quick technical notes. If you have any problems, the easiest thing to do is use the question box and we'll do our best to assist you. We found that if all else fails, simply log out and log back in to rejoin the webinar. I'll introduce today's speaker in just a moment, but first a few words about Photonics Media. We publish Photonics Spectra magazine, as well as the magazines Biophotonics, Industrial Photonics, and Europhotonics. Subscriptions are free and forms are available on our website, photonics.com. We also produce a weekly newscast about photonics called Light Matters that can be accessed on our homepage. During the webinar, you may type any questions you have in the question box in the webinar program, and we'll answer as many as time allows after the presentation is complete. Please note that although we allow questions throughout the hour, we'll only answer them after the presentation is over. Also, there will be a series of polls throughout the webinar, and we would appreciate your participation. Our presenter today is Senior Application Specialist for the Life Sciences Products at Excelitas Technologies, Dr. Kavita Aswani. Kavita holds a PhD from the University of Iowa and has 7 years of scientific research experience and over 14 years of applications experience in the microscopy and fluorescence industry. She has authored and reviewed several publications and journal articles, and she has worked in the areas of wide-field illumination microscopy, laser scanning microscopy, and flow cytometry. Kavita is also an active member of the Society for Neuroscience and the Royal Microscopical Society. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kavita Aswani, and please begin your presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you. And thank you for the introduction. Thank you for attending. Sorry, I just got to figure out my screen here. So welcome to the webinar. Today what I wanted to talk about is time-lapse imaging with lamp and LED, and specifically stability versus repeatability. So with the introduction of LEDs into the microscopy fluorescence landscape, there have been a lot of questions about, how stable is it compared to lamps, and I hope to answer some of that very complicated question in this webinar today. Just to give you a brief overview of X-Cite. Thank you. X-Cite is, we produce lamp products more recently LEDs, as well as OEM solutions. We have over 25,000 X-Cite systems installed worldwide, and our name is very well known. We have been designing and creating light solutions since 1984. Now, for those of you who are confused about why Brian was mentioning Excelitas, is that we are now part of Excelitas Technologies, and we became part of Excelitas in November 2013. Excelitas itself has over 5,000 employees worldwide, with a large network of design and manufacturing facilities all over the globe. So that's just to introduce us. We are still X-Cite, but we now are part of the Excelitas Technologies group. So today's webinar, I hope to talk a little bit about LEDs versus lamp, because I know that that is still a very prevalent question out in the market. What should we use? Which one's better as far as spectrum, as far as stability, as far as power? Then I will talk stability versus repeatability, and which is a better measure of stability. And also I would like to talk a little bit about some light source options. So it's time for our first poll, and if you don't mind, there you go. So the first question that I have is, do you currently use LEDs in your imaging? So before we continue with the lamp versus LED and which one you should use or which one's better for your application, I just wanted to get an idea of how many of you are already invested in LED or testing them out or checking to see which ones would be better for your application. So thank you for that vote, and I will now close it and move on with the webinar. Thank you for that. So as far as lamps being used in fluorescence, so lamps in fluorescence have been used, the first commercially available HBO system, which is what they used to be called, was in the 1930s, around that time. Now, when I'm talking about lamps in fluorescence, I'm talking about HBOs, I'm talking about mercuries, I'm talking about metal halides, because there are several terms that describe the basic bulb format to excite fluorescence. They have been used for a long, long time, and they have a wide spectrum and very high power. Yes, it is peaky depending on where you look in the spectrum, but a lot of fluorophores have been designed around those peaks, and therefore that shows how long these things have been around, and developments are according to the peaks. The lamps do need to stay on most of the time because you turn them on, it has a warm-up time, and most of the time you leave it on for the entire duration of the experiment, and then you physically shutter it to prevent the light from entering your microscope or from entering your camera. The lifetime of traditional HBOs is about 100 to 200 hours if you're lucky. The newer X-Cite lamps that we make are guaranteed for 2,000 hours, but usually go for 3,000 or 4,000. The other thing about lamps is that if they are the ones that last you 100 to 200 hours, you are replacing them quite often, and those can cost about $200 a pop. You also have the light guide replacement if your light source is light guide delivered, and that's something that needs to be replaced as well because it has a finite lifetime. LEDs, on the other hand, do not have to stay on the entire time that you are doing your imaging. The reason for this is because they have instant on and off, and it's an electronic shutter versus a physical shutter. And what that means is that you apply current to the LED, light comes on, you turn off the current to the LED, the light goes off, and you can also vary the intensity by altering the amount of current reaching the LED. Because of this technology, you can also switch between one color and the other color if your LED has several colors. And this also enables you to image faster and also turn on and off whenever you want to, not expose your sample to light. LEDs have lower vibration in most of the instruments. Like I said, there's no warm-up or cool-down time. You simply turn it off or turn it on. The output stability is much better than lamps, and I hope to go through a little more of that in the next few slides. There is no mercury, so there's no mercury disposal issues, and a lot of labs are going green, and they do not want to deal with the mercury disposal, so they are quite happy with the invention of LED for microscopy. They do consume less power, and they do produce less heat, but there is a caveat to that because LEDs are also prone to heat, and in fact they are more sensitive to heat than lamps are. So even though they are cooler, they are more sensitive to heat than lamps are, because if the LED gets too hot, it will affect the output, it will affect the stability, and it will affect the lifetime. So as I said, in the left column here we have lamps. They take long to stabilize. LED is stable within minutes. Lamp comes with consumables of the lamp and potentially the liquid light guide. With LEDs as well, you could have a liquid light guide, but you do not have a bulb, so you do not have to replace that. The lamp is always on, but is physically shuttered before the light gets into the microscope. With an LED, you turn it off, you turn it on, just with a simple click of a button. Lamp covers the entire spectrum, all the way from your Fura through your DAPI, GFP, TRITSI, Psi5, and all the way to your Psi7s. LEDs, they are available in either specific wavelengths to cover most of those fluorophores, or you can combine 3 or 4 or 5 of those to create a so-called white light spectrum. Lamp has mercury disposal issues. LEDs do not, because there is no mercury. Lamps have a short lifetime from 100 to a couple thousand hours. LEDs are usually a minimum of 10,000 hours. Our X-Cite LEDs are 20 to 25,000 hours guaranteed. Lamps also do have a dramatic intensity drop over their life, but with the LEDs, you have a much gradual decrease in intensity over the life of the LED. With lamps, you definitely need filters. So with lamps, you have a white light spectrum, and you do need filters within your microscope to be able to pick off the wavelengths that you need to excite your DAPI or your GFP or whatever fluorophore you're imaging. With LEDs, if you have a white light spectrum, the same applies. You do require filters. If you do have an LED that has separate wavelengths, then you can filter the light within the instrument before it enters the microscope. But you will require a dichroic and emitter in your microscope. If you could use a multiband dichroic and a multiband emitter in your microscope, then you're not relying on the switching speed of your filter turret in order to take your images, and you are able to image much faster if you have the capability of doing that. And the stability, I will talk about more in the next few slides. So time for our second poll. If you are still using lamp systems, I would love to know why. Is it because it's just attached to your microscope and you use it and you haven't bothered replacing it? Is it because you have a closet full of bulbs and you have to wait till you run out of those before you purchase or invest in LED technology? Is it because you require the lamp spectrum for your fluorophores, or is it because you just can't be bothered to change? And if you don't use lamps, then that would be very unusual, but I'd be interested to know if you don't. HBOs and lamps are something that's just always been in a lab, especially if you're in a multi-user facility. And they're just there. Most people don't even bother about them because it's somebody else's job to change the bulb or the light guide. So I'm just curious to know if somebody is using lamps and why. So thank you for your answers to that. So a little bit about stability. When you're talking about stability, you're talking about temporal stability, so between your exposures, between your experiments, or over the entire lifetime of your bulb or LED. With most experiments, chances are you're taking more than one, you're capturing more than one image. Therefore, with a lamp, you have the lamp on the entire time, and you're physically shuttering every time the camera takes a picture. So how do you know that your lamp is stable between the different exposures? And if I have an experiment now and I go away and I incubate for 2 hours to come back and take another picture, my control is the same, hopefully, between the 2 hours, but I don't know whether my lamp has degraded or something weird has happened within those 2 hours, or for that matter with the LED. And that's something that should be that you should bear in mind when you're conducting your experiments. Now, over the lifetime, if I decide to get lazy and not do my controls from 1 year to the next, which is a bit extreme, so let's go from 1 week to the next. Within that week or within those few months, how much has the intensity of my light changed? And is that something that I measure, or I just take it as a stable figure and don't bother? Spatially as well, you need to think about uniformity and stability. So what that means is if I'm looking at this slide over here, I want to make sure that the light hitting my slide over here is the same as the light hitting my slide on this side, just because if I'm looking at a whole group of cells and one is dimly lit, whereas the other is nice and brightly lit, my data is going to be skewed. Within the sample, I want to make sure that I have uniformity. Most of the systems with liquid light guides do provide uniform illumination because the liquid in the light guide helps spread out the light evenly. The other thing that you should be aware of with lamps is what is called arc wander, and what that can appear as is a flash sometimes. And hopefully, if you catch that within your images, you're lucky and you know that you should exclude that image from your experiments. But if you don't know that it's happened, then that could be quite tricky as far as your data analysis. So why do we need stability or repeatability? As far as fluorescence, microscopy, and imaging, it's no longer as simple as is it there or not. There is more quantitative There are more quantitative measurements. Sometimes we use ratiometric dyes. So if you have your Fura without calcium and your Fura with calcium, between those two images, there is a time difference. And in that time, you want to make sure that your light source is not contributing to the differences of your Fura labeling with and without calcium. You want to make sure it's whatever's in the sample that's causing the difference. With live cell imaging, again, time-lapse imaging, you have potentially live cells, and you're taking an image, you're adding a drug, and you're trying to see what happens to the cell or the morphology or certain labeling while the cell is incubating with whatever drug it is that you've added. With live cell imaging, there are more complex imaging parameters as well. You have to think of of the media that you're imaging through. You have to think about photobleaching. You have to make sure that your sample is happy. And you have to think about whatever's happening within the cell physiologically. And what I'm trying to say here is that you want to make sure that it's not your light source that is causing the difference between your images. You want to make sure that it's your actual experiment. So what is time-lapse imaging? Just briefly, it's imaging over time. You expose your sample to a camera to take a picture every now and then, depending on how your experiment is. But you do need to make sure that you know that a lamp, a traditional HBO or mercury, they do degrade even through your experiment, and I do have an example of that later on in the webinar. So I just briefly want to talk about the different lamps and LED varieties in relation to stability. You have AC and DC lamps, which are these, which basically bulb-based. You have feedback systems, which will keep the intensity stable throughout a defined amount of time. And then you have LED systems, which are the fast on and off, and we'll have a look at the stability of those as well. So just to start out with the stability of lamps. Now, the one thing to point out is there will always be the power versus the stability war. If you want something that is super powerful, like most lamps are, sometimes more than is required for most experiments, you will have the stability issue. Whereas if you have a nice and stable source, chances are something is being compensated to give you that stability, and that might be a hit on the power. So if you look at the graph here on the left, this is the blue graph is your typical AC lamp. And some of you might be scared by looking at this because you see this pulse. And it's quite a sharp pulse every 3 milliseconds. The good news is that that is not detectable by the eye, and it won't be detectable by most of your camera integration times. If you then look at the bottom here, this fairly flat line is a DC system. So this is a DC bulb and the power output of a DC bulb, whereas the blue depicts your AC bulb. And this is the case for any AC bulb, no matter where you purchase it. Also, another thing to point out here on the left is that your time scale is 45 milliseconds, so it is a bit drastic. If you then look at a more realistic timeline of 2 hours, you will see the blue curve is your AC lamp, and you can see there's a plus minus 2% intensity variation. Not too bad for, again, most experiments, but for certain fast imaging, or if you're doing something over a long, long time, that might be an issue. If you look at the if you look at the green line, you're looking at a DC lamp. And DC lamps are inherently more stable than AC lamps are. If you then look at a DC lamp, just a normal DC lamp, here the time scale has been extended now to 100 hours. You will see that the intensity drops by about 10%. And this is only over 100 hours. If you then engage a closed-loop feedback mechanism, and what that does is it automatically adjusts the iris to make sure that your power output stays stable over, let's say, 100 hours here. You can see that the stability is much, much better, and you're looking at about a plus minus 1 or 2%, which is not too bad. So this is something that you would use for a long-term experiment or something that you needed to do over a couple days, or even somewhere where you require very, very short exposures. So if you have calcium imaging or something like that, and you want to make sure that every time you take an image, it is fairly stable, you would go with the DC lamp. Now I'm going to switch to LED stability. Now, when you talk about LED stability, it is more complex than just saying how stable is it, because there's a lot of parameters that affect LED stability. It's how long has the bulb been on? Has it been a cold start? Have you done a lot of on and offs? And there are several variabilities. And the whole point of me showing you this here is that when you turn on the LED and you look at stability, this is over 25 hours. This is using four of our different colored LEDs. You can see that the stability in general is better than 0.5%. If, however, you look closer, you will see that when you initially start up, there is a increase in the power, and then it decreases before it stabilizes. Now, this start versus when it stabilizes is a factor of thermal regulation and thermal management. When LEDs increase in temperature, there is an intensity drop. The smaller the output, the optical output variation, the better the thermal management. So from start to when it stabilizes, if you are well thermally managed, the drop will not be as high, as you can see with one of our units. If you look at another unit that is not very well thermally managed, you can see that this drop is much more significant. And what that means is that the LEDs are not being thermally managed very well, which then puts increase on the stress. It wears the LED over the lifetime. It wears the it has a hit on the output, and it also affects the stability. So in a real-life situation, if you're looking at 10, 20, 50, and 100 millisecond exposures, as shown here with the different colors, you can see that the stability is better than 0.05%. Great. But is this little dip here going to affect my results? And that is the question that is something that a lot of people ask. So what we tried to do is repeat a time-lapse type of setup. So what's been done here is that over 10 minutes, we have pulsed the LED, turned it on for 10 milliseconds, turned it off for 500, turn it on for 10 milliseconds, turn it off for 500, turn it on for 10 milliseconds, and do that for a whole 10 minutes. If you then take these pulses, all of them, and overlay them, which is in the inset over here, you can see that there is very, very minimal difference between these different curves, and you can't really tell the outlines of one being different from the other. What that means is that every 10 millisecond exposure in this sample, every time you expose your sample to light, it is the same amount of light that is reaching your sample. This area under the curve is the same for every single exposure, which means that your data, your pulses or your exposures are reproducible. And that's basically the moral of the story here, is that even though you may see the initial dip or whatever, because it's inherent in LEDs, there's nothing we can do about that. But if you look at the overall how much light is reaching your sample, it is repeatable every single time you turn the LED on and off. And that's the beauty of LEDs. So just to give you some examples of real-life examples between the HBO systems, which is on the left here, and one of our newer LED units. This was done by our collaborators at the EMBL in Germany. So what they did is, it's a green chroma slide. They have used a GFP filter cube, and they have acquired images at 20 millisecond exposures over 3 minutes. So that gives you, as it says down here, 2,258 images. And you can see the intensity difference here. In this case, with the HBO lamp, is about 2%. This is only over 3 minutes, whereas if you look at the 120 LED, which is an LED system, the intensity variation is 0.2%. So it's clear which one's more stable between these two. If you then, I also wanted to touch briefly on happy cells. This is where you can pulse an LED, and like I said, every time you pulse the LED, you have the same amount of light hitting your sample. You can pulse the LEDs at the touch of a button for whatever duration that you want. And what we found here in this study is that cells are happier when exposed to pulsed light versus continuous LED exposure. And details of that are in this on our website in the webinar section. But to give you a brief overview of what was done here, what we did is we looked at the levels of a phototoxicity indicator. So we pretended like we were imaging every few minutes. I think it was about every minute we were imaging, and then we would image for the phototoxicity indicator. And with the blue curve shows the continuous LED exposure. On the green curve, you see pulsed LED exposure. On the axis is the phototoxicity indicator. So with your control, you will still have some phototoxicity because the sample's sitting there on the stage. It's not happy. So some phototoxicity labeling will occur. If you then look at pulsed illumination, this is your phototoxicity indicator. And if you look at continuous illumination, there is significantly larger amount of phototoxic byproducts produced by the cells. So this was just a side bar about basically cells being happier with pulsed LED versus continuous LED. What we then had was, again, our EMBL collaborators looking at proliferation using their lamp system, which they've always used, versus our LED system that they tested. And here we have HeLa cells expressing M-cherry. Cells were imaged every 30 minutes for 48 hours. And with the lamp versus the LED, the lamp had less proliferation when compared to LEDs, which is summarized here. So this is the proliferation when imaging with traditional HBO. The cells proliferated more when they were imaged with LED, and that could be because of filter leakage. We're not entirely sure what exactly is happening here, but the cells seem to be happier when they're imaged with LED versus HBO. I also wanted to point out stability over time. If you look at the lifetime, and this is of our lamps, which we guarantee for 2,000 hours, the intensity of the lamp from start to 2,000 hours goes down by 50%. This is assuming there's no, this is just inherently property of the lamps. Whereas if you look at LEDs, which usually are about 20,000 hours, there's only a 30% drop after that much duration. And if you reach that kind of duration and more, which they are known to last for, then, you know, as far as your intensity, you're doing pretty well. If you look at something more realistic, which is a 48-hour experiment, LED reduction in intensity was insignificant from the start of the experiment to the finish, whereas the HPO lamp, we saw a 20% intensity drop from when we started the experiment. So that's just a brief summary of LEDs, lamps, the different technologies, and as well why you would use one versus the other, the pulsing, and how it helps increasing the lifetime of your sample and of your fluorophores. Again, I do encourage you to check out the webinar on our website, which is about lamps versus LEDs and phototoxicity indicator. So now we have another poll, which is, are you thinking of investing in LED technology? So is this something that if you're a student, your advisor has asked you to look into? Is this something you're just completely not interested in because you don't like LED technology or you don't know enough about it? Or if you are very, very, very much interested in LED, and that's why you've come to listen to the webinar, so you can get a little more information about it. So very interesting results. Thank you for that. So it's good to know that most of you are interested in LED technology, and thank you for your feedback. So I just wanted to quickly run through, oh, excuse me. the different LED options while I have you, while I have your attention, so you get a little bit of background of what these different things are. If my slide moves. Okay, so when I was talking about the different LED options, I said that you have the white light versions, which is basically select LEDs that are put together to produce a white light spectrum. And as I mentioned, with some there are no consumable parts, as in this guy, whereas with some there are consumables, which is the light guide. But none of these guys have lamps, so you don't have to ever replace a bulb. With this guy, this is what I was talking about when I mentioned the fact that you have different LED wavelengths, and you can pick and choose whatever you want, and you can also pulse the LED very, very fast to test for yourselves if your samples last longer by pulsing versus continuous illumination. So the white light LEDs, again, I just wanted to quickly cover on these. They're high power, they're broad spectrum, they have no maintenance, there's no warm-up. You can quickly turn every LED, the entire system on and off, and there's zero vibration, so you don't have a big HBO mount on the back of your microscope that might cause physical vibration that gets to your sample. They cover most of the fluorophores that people use. If you are looking at something up here in the Fura range or something down here in the size 7 range, as of today, an LED would not be a very good solution for you because we just don't have the power in those kind of areas. So, and again, just to review the spectra, you know, your DAPI is covered, your GFP is covered, your FITC and M-Cherry are covered in both of these white light systems. And again, if you need 340 for Fura, or if you're looking at size 7 somewhere down here, chances are it won't be very strong. And the reason for that is because there's no demand for those kind of wavelengths in like the lighting industry or in your LED TVs at home. Therefore, the prices are very, very high. And the lifetimes are very low. So if somebody contacts me and says, can you make a 340 LED? Absolutely. You know, if you talk to our R&D people, they'll get it made, but their lifetime will be short and the price will be a lot. And we don't like to do that to our customers. As far as control options for these LED units, for those of you who are not familiar with LEDs out there, they have all sorts of intensity control, TTL control. Some have analog. Some are just simple on and off. But most of them you can control through USB for on and on, or you can control it through your drivers that are compatible with the X-Cite unit. So for all the microscope company software, all of those will control most of these light sources. And to give you an idea of how quickly they switch on and off, you're looking at 500 microseconds USB and 50 microseconds TTL, which is more than what most people want. As far as the intensity control, they're usually around 1%. They can fit on all microscope models, even if you have an old microscope that you want to upgrade with a new lamp or LED. It's something that can be done because most LED manufacturers will adapt to existing and old microscopes as well. Stability, we talked about, depending on the unit, it can be better than 0.5%. And as I talked about lifetime, these things last forever, and you don't have to really do anything to them other than avoid dropping them. So in summary, LEDs are best for stability, happy cells, long life, lack of consumables, lack of mercury for those who are moving toward more green technology, fast on and off, as well as fast switching. Lamps, though, still, you know, the purpose of this webinar is not to put down lamps, because lamps still have the maximum intensity for certain applications that require super high intensity. And as I mentioned, over 670 nanometers and under 360 nanometers, LEDs are just not practical. And lamps are still very useful in this space. And, you know, like I said, lamps have been around forever. People are used to them. They're comfortable with them. And hopefully this background on LED technology will enable you to think that it's not scary technology, it's actually useful. And depending on your application, it might be better than lamps. And just to conclude, and I hope that this has been conveyed, that repeatability is a much better measure than stability as far as imaging goes with microscopy and fluorescence. So I thank you, and if you have any webinar comments or questions that are not answered here, if you could please email myself, that would be great. And I think I'm done, Brian.
All right, thank you, Kavita. I'd like to remind everyone that if you have a question for our speaker today, now's the time to enter it in the question box of the webinar program. If we don't have time to get to everyone's questions, we'll post those with the archived version of the webinar on photonics.com. So if you can go ahead and ask questions now. Kavita's opening a poll real quick to close.
Yes, please.
Out.
I forgot about that one.
Yeah. So if you could answer the poll and then post any questions you have.
Okay, thank you for answering that last poll. Brian, go ahead with.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start with a question here. Kavita, can you please explain no filter requirement for LEDs?
So what I was talking about in that example was basically if you have single LEDs, switchable LEDs in your unit, then what you can do is simply filter the excitation at the LEDs within the unit and then have your dichroics and emitters in the microscope. If you could do a multiband dichroic and a multiband emitter, then you wouldn't need to rely on the filter turret in order to do your actual switching between the different. Hello?
Hey, Kavita, can you begin that again? I think we lost you for a minute there.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. So basically, what the question was, what do you mean when you say you don't need filters with LED? So if you have a white spectrum LED, you absolutely do need filters within your microscope. If you do have a multi-wavelength LED where the LEDs are within a unit, you can then filter the excitation light before it enters the microscope and then put your multi-band dichroic and your multi-band emitter in the microscope. That way you can switch the LEDs very, very fast and capture your images and not have to rely on the movement of a filter turret. So I hope that's clearer.
Okay, and why do cells prefer pulsing versus continuous LED?
So there's two theories about the cells with the pulsing versus the continuous. So one is that if you pulse, then the cell has time to recover between every time you hit it with light. So the cell itself has time to relax and not generate too many reactive oxygen species. The second is your fluorophore itself has time to relax and doesn't go into triplet state, which then produces, well, zero fluorescence essentially. So those are the two theories right now, and that's all we have for now. It could be one or two, or it could be a combination.
And why are LEDs not available in UV and IR range?
Again, as I mentioned, those aren't wavelengths that are popular for other industries. Therefore, they haven't been able to migrate over to microscopy, which is a very, very, very small industry in comparison to, your lighting industries and and areas like that. So it definitely is available, but it would come at a very high price point and a very low lifetime.
And John asks, X-Cite 120Q power versus 120 LED across the spectrum. I think he's asking for a comparison.
That's a good one, and we get that one a lot, actually. And it entirely depends on the fluorophore. So if you're looking at DAPI, for example, some LED systems could prove more powerful than your 120Q systems. If you're looking at it depends entirely on the fluorophore. I will tell you that within like the 540 to 570, LEDs will not be as bright as lamps, but at the red or at the blue, depending on which spectrum you're looking at, it really varies. And I always have trouble answering that one without showing graphs.
Okay, we got a question from Marcel. He says, I want to scan my samples with the whole spectrum from 350 nanometers to 700 nanometers in 50 nanometer parts to detect natural fluorescence. The non-continuity of the LED lamp spectra, is that a problem from reproducibility and intensity comparison between different parts of the spectrum? Would lamps still be better, or should I switch to LEDs?
That is a tricky one. If you want to go through something like the whole spectrum, your best bet would be going with something like a xenon, which is a flat line through the spectrum. That way, when you're comparing your different images, you're looking at an apples-to-apples comparison. And Marcel, you're absolutely right. Because of the bumps and the peaks, you will not be able to compare between the 50 nanometer chunks that you're talking about. You're looking at spectral imaging all the way from 350 to 700. If you're comparing two separate samples at these different 50 nanometer chunks, then you might have some luck. But if you're comparing one 50 nanometer chunk with the other in the same exact sample, that might be more tricky. And if that was completely unclear, you can contact me offline.
All right, that looks like all the questions we have to answer here today. In the next few days, we're going to work on getting the recording of this webinar up. Oh, it looks like we got one more question. What rates are the LEDs pulsed at? Is asked by Claire Brown.
Oh, hi, Claire. So in that particular example, if you're talking about the X-LED, you can pulse them at whatever rate you want to. In the particular example that I presented about the live set versus the continuous versus the pulse, that one was at 30 microseconds. You can go as fast as 10 microseconds if you wanted to, but that particular experiment was at 30 microseconds. And like I said, you can define it as you want to within the software.
All right, as I began saying, we'll work on getting this recording up on photonics.com. If you did not get a chance to view the entire thing, or you want to share it with a colleague. So once again, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar, sponsored by X-Cite. You can go to photonics.com to view more of our upcoming webinars.